Hey guys, it's Daniel, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Beatles. How did the Beatles write music? How did they write songs? What were some of the Beatles' musical influences? What techniques did the Beatles use when they were creating their music? We're going to be taking a look at some of that in this video, as well as the influence the Beatles had on music in general. As always, all the interviews in this video are original. I'm the one conducting them. So if you want to support me, please subscribe to my channel. Lots of rock and roll and music related videos here. Thank you for watching.
I would agree wholly that the blues underpinning, that's the departure point to all of rock. Very American-based influences started rock, but the introduction of outside influences, and particularly classical music, those are important elements that kind of found their way in.
You can definitely hear the difference between rock from Europe as opposed to rock from America. It does sound different. At home in America, people grew up listening to blues and jazz. At home in Europe, people grew up listening to classical music, studying classical music.
And I think the first time that I really fully noticed that, probably the Revolver album of the Beatles, the first time I heard string quartet in Eleanor Rigby, that is, Eleanor Rigby is an entirely classically kind of underpinned piece of music.
The one you're painting is where Ringo lived?
No, John.
John lived here and Ringo lived downstairs?
No, Ringo never lived here, he just owned it.
Oh, okay.
John rented here and downstairs.
Classical music is a very European, British type of influence on the story of classic rock.
I think one of the interesting things about the Beatles was they listened to everything. So they listened to jazz music, some of the crooners, they listened to skiffle music, they listened to early American rock and roll. It all seeped in and influenced the Beatles. When they met George Martin was a classically trained musician. He really didn't have a lot of experience with skiffle or with rock and roll or anything like that. So his influence on the Beatles was to help to tighten their sound and add in sort of classical arrangements. So you start to hear that really coming into play with a song like Yesterday, which was 1965, and then as the Beatles get more advanced in their songwriting and more advanced in their instrumentation, start to explore the studio, you see more piano coming in as well, sometimes played by George Martin, sometimes played by one of the Beatles.
If you listen to a song like Please Please Me, those harmonies are completely, very clearly where, you know, the one note is held by, you know, one of the singers, and while the other one moves around it. That's very Everly Brothers. They were copying Kathy's Clown, as a matter of fact, particularly on Please Please, in my opinion. But doing a great job. I mean, they made it their own. But they were very heavily influenced. They've admitted it, you know, by the Everlys, by a lot of different people too. I mean, the Beatles were the masters of taking cool stuff and maybe making it even cooler, you know, but certainly making it their own. But, you know, it was a big influence, you know, country music. And you listen to the guitar solo on All My Lovin' by the Beatles. It's completely Chet Atkins. And then the Beatles covered Buck Owens songs, you know. So clearly country had a big influence on the evolution of rock and roll.
Many people don't know the Beatles could not read or write music, as was the case with a lot of these bands in the early 60s. And so everything was done by ear. And what's interesting with the Beatles is they were always trying to find some new chord or stumble upon some new fingering, whether it was a guitar or whether it was a piano, an instrument they were less comfortable with. And sometimes they would stumble on a chord and they would say, that's great, let's use that. They did it in I Want to Hold Your Hand, as a matter of fact. John and Paul were sitting at the piano writing the song. Paul plays a minor chord that was sort of out of the blue, and John says, that was great, what was that? Let's get that down. And that's how the writing process worked. It wasn't so much writing out a chord chart or having some preconceived notion. It was what sounded good. And the Beatles always wanted to surprise you. They wanted to take you someplace different with their chords and then bring you back to someplace you felt comfortable. And it's completely subconscious if you don't know anything about music, but it works really well. It's why their songs last so well today. One of the great things about classic rock is the idea of always trying to push the limits in terms of instrumentation, arrangements, and so forth. And one of the things that happened in the late 50s, 60s was this idea of adding distortion to a recording. And it was not something that was commonplace, but there was a song that came out by Bobby Sox called Zippity Doo Dah. Phil Spector produced it, and the guitarist on that song had accidentally distorted his guitar. Phil Spector decided to leave that in the recording. Everyone heard that and they wanted that sound. And so guitar manufacturers were trying to make distortion pedals. Some, like Vox, who made a lot of the Beatles equipment, were very reluctant to come out with a distortion pedal because they thought, why would you want to add distortion? Everyone's trying to get rid of distortion in recordings. But they did make one, and the Beatles either used one made by Vox or one made by a guy named Gary Hurst called a tone bender. And it was used on a song called Think for Yourself with Paul's bass. So on Rubber Soul, Think for Yourself has a normal bass, and it has the bass through this tone bender, which creates a distorted bass sound, a very unusual effect for the time. So I remember working on a film score, and I was trying to find the right piano sound for this piece I'd written. And a whole day had gone by, and I realized I still was picking out samples. I hadn't written a note of music. Which was very frustrating because you don't get into the creative process that way. It's a different type of creation. It's picking sounds as opposed to writing music. The Beatles didn't have the luxury of doing that. They could try different experiments out in the studio, but their instrumental palette was very limited. The recording technology was extremely limited. And so they had to get something right. And they could overdub, they could add things. As they started getting more advanced in the studio, they could layer and layer and layer. But it was very hard to go back and undo things that they'd already recorded. The only thing they could do is start over again.
So it forced you to be a good musician?
Yeah, it forces you to really be a good musician, to have good ears. It forces the engineers and the producers to make sure the sound is good, because when you start layering instruments, you have this tendency to bury the drums. You know, all of a sudden you lose something, and you can't do that and get a good recording out of it. The Beatles existed in a moment of time where everyone was tuned in to one of a few radio stations, one of a few TV channels. You had a lot of cultural change going on in the 60s, and it was the right place, right time. And you had a group with 3 very strong songwriters that had honed their craft through thousands and thousands of hours of playing. And you just don't get that these days. We are so fragmented in our rock and roll. One person's classic rock is another person's, heavy metal or country rock or what have you. It's all very fragmented. And the Beatles were, for a moment in time, they were the focus of anyone who liked popular music. There are a lot of factors that are changing the way music is made and the way music is distributed. Today, most artists are recording using computers, using things like Pro Tools, where they can record 200 tracks without taking up any space on their hard disk. They can go back and pick the ones they like. They can auto-tune. They can decide they want to change out the piano for an organ. That's all done after the fact. In the Beatles' day, and in the real classic rock era, what you got down to tape, that was it. You could erase it, you could maybe overdub, add something, but you couldn't change the sound after the fact. You had very limited control over that. So I think that's one thing that's a big change, is the way recording is done. A lot of bands don't do this, setting up the microphones and record. They do it in the computer. They do it in the box. And the whole way music is distributed, there's none of this waiting for the next Beatles release, which is coming out this day, and we all wait around for it, and then we go to the record store and we buy the vinyl. Nowadays, you have so many different ways of getting music. You have so many different ways of packaging the music. You can buy just one song instead of an album. So it's very, very different than it was, certainly in the late 60s, early 70s.
For me, when I think of classic rock, I'm selfish about it because I feel like I grew up in the best generation of music ever. And I don't necessarily think about the guys that influenced the Beatles. For me, day one was Ed Sullivan, Beatles performing and changing the world of music, okay? And changing my life, okay? Not only did it make me want to play guitar, but, which, thank you God, I was, given some talent towards just innately, but honestly, it starts there for me. And the wealth of bands and songs and the just the social changes that came from it was pretty remarkable to watch. You know, my brother was a little older than me, and he had to deal with, when he wanted to grow hair, you know, them being sent to the dean's office. You know what I mean? You couldn't have, you know, long hair, anything that resembled the Beatles.
Kennedy had just been shot, and everyone was on a downer, and then all of a sudden the Beatles came along, and it was like a nice relief to get our mind off all that, and, you know, thinking that the whole world wasn't in fact going to hell in a handbasket, you know, and they were great. They were funny and so forth. They just took us along with them, and they became better and better and better, and they evolved, and they took the genre, and they always kept it rock and rolly. They kept the beat and pretty much the passion, and they kept that going, and whatever they did, the whole world went along with them. Took the whole world on the ride with them. It's pretty amazing, really.
There was that big show, the Ed Sullivan Show, which we all watched all the time, and the Beatles came on. That was 1964, and we all got all excited, and my sister and me got on the phone and called 2 other sisters that we know, and another girl down the road, and we formed the Pleasure Seekers, the first all-girl band that I was with. And it was as a direct result of seeing the Beatles on television.
Beatles made you want to be a musician?
Well, no, I was already a musician. I come from a very musical family, and I already played classical piano and percussion. But when we saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, me, one of my sisters, and 2 other sisters, and another girl, all from the same area, got on the phones, on the extensions, and were screaming, and hey, why don't we form an all-girl band? Bang. So that was instrumental in starting the all-girl band, 100%. Elvis Presley I saw when I was 6, and I decided I wanted to be him at 6. And then at 14, the Beatles on the same television show, and we formed an all-girl band from that day. So very instrumental to me as a person anyway. I even told Paul McCartney that story. He absolutely loved it. He was thrilled.
In my mind, if I had to really pick a date to say this is when classic rock started, I would say February 9th, 1964. That's my opinion.
I like so many other contemporary musicians like myself, or people in the industry, or just fans. If you were old enough to understand what was on TV that night in February of '64 on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was popular anyway. People always watched that. That was like a family thing for my parents and my brother and I to watch. Oddly enough, even though the show looks pretty odd if you looked at the rest of the show that the Beatles actually performed on. But, you know, Ed Sullivan getting them to perform really did change the entire music industry, and probably was the start of certainly the British invasion and rock and roll, the way we still celebrate it, but in arguably classic rock, like you said. I was home watching it, black and white, there it was. I'm jumping up and down on my bed, singing along, and knew that this was something incredible, okay? There was no doubt that their energy and their talent and the fun that they had doing that just really made everybody feel something wonderful, okay? America was going through like some really tough things, you know. The president was just assassinated, you know, in November the year before, and that was pretty devastating for everybody. It was definitely a big down, you know. And I do think that music's something that can like kind of lift everybody's spirit, you know. And even if the parents were kind of threatened, my parents did, it wasn't a big deal, okay? But even if there was that kind of generational gap of like, I don't know. In fact, just recently, the Grammy Museum in Los Angeles was showing everything about, very specifically, the you know, entry of the Beatles to America and changing the world, okay? So it didn't go too much later. It went to like the touring years in America, 64, 65, 66. And it was great because I loved the, you know, obviously the stuff that they showcased, and they had some video, but there was no doubt that their impact was so important, you know, and how everybody's world just kind of like was upside down, and it just changed the touring industry, merchandising, obviously musical styles because of all the other bands that maybe sounded a bit like them or wanted to be like them or wanted to be the anti-Beatles, you know. It's just the Beatles really, I don't think they had some huge master plan of what was going to happen, but the truth was everybody wanted to know what was happening with them and to them and what they started in the sense of music.
Did the Beatles and the British invasion influence you?
Oh, it inspired me to get into the business. I was working like little blues gigs on Yorkville here in Toronto the first time I heard the Beatles. And between the Beatles and Dylan, I think it really opened my eyes to what could be done with lyric. It didn't have to just be shop babaloo bop-a-lop bam boom, you know what I mean? They were writing some meaningful stuff and changing the world with it. So I think between Dylan and the Beatles, they inspired a whole generation. I remember back in the 60s, everybody wanted Beatle boots. You had to be wearing your high heel Beatle boots, you know?
The era of the Beatles was timing as much as anything. The era of the media being worldwide came into play just about the time they came into play. The whole political system came in, at least in the United States, with this Camelot type of feeling with the Kennedys. It all happened at the same time, and the Beatles were the primary group that made that happen. Just timing. And then they were very good to take advantage of that with their artistry.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkissian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.